absolutely lovely setting, which is really nice. And I'm actually quite glad to be out because my youngest daughter is watching K-pop Demon Hunters, which is I've escaped watching that all evening, so thank you. So I'm going to talk about Cowfield Farm is the official name of the site. And before I start, I should say that I'm presenting the information. I wrote up the report, which has just been published in the Transactions of the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society, but you can access a free, longer and more detailed version via our website. So if you go to Cotswold Archaeology's website, which is actually really good, got a virtual museum and things, you can download that report for free and plenty of others as well. So anything I say and you want to find out more information about it, do ask questions at the end, but you can also go to those reports. Also, if I start speaking in jargon, please do stop me, wave your hands, jump up and down, and I'll explain what I'm talking about. And I'm standing here as a sort of sole person, but what we're presenting here is actually the sort of the result of teamwork. So I don't know how many people were involved in this project over the course of time, but there's the field workers who are the very obvious archaeologists, and then all the behind the scenes people who analyse pottery, animal bone, do our finds washing and so on and so forth. So I'm basically taking credit for their hard work. So at the back of your mind, just keep in mind all those hard-working archaeologists you never really see. So it was an excavation in 2019, which it's a fair while ago now, but these things take a while to come to fruition. And it was done in advance of a new car park. So pretty much all the work we do as a company is prompted by development work, so housing, new infrastructure, things like that. So wherever you see somebody digging a hole, you might well find an archaeologist. You're all probably going to be pretty familiar with Tewkesbury, but I'm going to run through the basic sort of landscape. So that's the site there, that red dot. And as you'll all know, it's very low lying around here. We're in the Vale, the Clay Vale, sort of prone to flooding. The blue lines that you can see radiating in are brooks and streams and so on, just marked on the principal ones. But you can see the site's right next to the Carrant Brook there, which will feature later on. So we knew about the moat in advance. Quite a few of the sites that we excavate are completely unknown about in advance, but this one survived as earthworks. I'll show you a photograph of it in a moment. So we knew it was there. So as soon as the development gained permission, they knew that they had to have archaeologists coming in to do some work in advance. So I'll talk about what we found. I'll describe it, and then I'll talk about our interpretation of that, and then there'll be time for some questions at the end. I'm going to focus completely on the medieval remains. There were little scraps of prehistory and Roman archaeology, which in this context aren't particularly relevant, but if you are interested in them, you can have a look at our online report. So the existing moat, the bottom photograph shows the moat, and I say earthwork. You can see it's barely there. We've had to draw this sort of dotted line around it. We're looking at the northwestern corner here, and you can just see there's sort of differential vegetation growth, a very slight, I mean, you really have to use your imagination there. You can just about see it. It's depicted on historic mapping. This is an 1829 map, and you can see the moat there very clearly. It's also on the 1841 tithe map and subsequent mapping, so it is very well established. And it also had, until 2004, that red mark there is actually a building. It was a brick-built farmhouse. Was occupied until recently and then burnt down in 2004. The moat itself is this sort of very broadly rectangular shape, slightly wider at the bottom end. Our site takes in the sort of uppermost 3/4 of it, so the bottom part actually lies outside of our site. But I'm afraid, as far as I can tell, it's actually been built over as well. So it's all gone to all intents and purposes. There's also a mill, which I'll refer to later on. So I've been told on pain of death, I can't go backwards with the slide, so you have to bear this in mind. So here's our moat, and then a few hundred yards further down this artificial waterway, which is a mill leat, is this mill, and there's the Carrant Brook around the edge. So this water line here is actually artificial, built to serve the mill. So the excavation, very unsurprisingly, it was very wet. It's a moat and it's in Tewkesbury. So we're looking from the top northeastern corner here. You can just about make out the line of the moat there, and then it extends beyond that hedgerow to where those industrial buildings are there. You can see our machine working away, that's sitting on the moat platform. There, just in there, you may be able to work out, or may be able to sort of just make out a wooden structure. That's a medieval bridge, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And just here is a brick-built bridge, which went with the later brick-built farmhouse, the one that burnt down in 2004. The little building there, I won't be talking about, but just out of interest, it's a listed building. It's a pigsty, and that was preserved in situ, so it should still be there. So what we do is we strip off the overburden, the topsoil, any modern layers with the machine. So there's an archaeologist directing the machine driver. So very carefully and slowly strip away those layers. And then we excavate by hand. And that enables us to create what we call a stratigraphic sequence, which is a bit of archaeological jargon. It just means that we're peeling back the layers in reverse order, so latest to earliest. And that enables us to build up a sequence of time. So we know the sort of relative sequence of all the deposits. And then we can date the finds that we found within each of those deposits in order to try and attach dates to the stratigraphic sequence. So that's the basic principle. Never works out quite as simply as that, as you can imagine, but that's the basic way of doing it. We do the dating by a mixture of finds evidence, usually pottery, but also other finds as well. Radiocarbon dating. There wasn't a great deal we could radiocarbon date on this site, but we did get a couple of radiocarbon dates. And something else I'll talk about later on called dendrochronological determination. It's a very long-winded way of saying tree ring dating, but I'll talk about that in a subsequent slide. So using this sort of stratigraphic analysis, looking at this sequence of deposits, we were able to determine that the moat wasn't actually the earliest feature on the site. So before the moat, there was actually occupation here. We think that it was a greenfield site, so this was a deliberate development by someone, and we'll come on to who that someone was later on a greenfield site, probably given its location close to the brook. It was probably meadows at the time. So if you imagine grazing meadows, somebody's come along, purchased or already owns the land and has decided to build a new foundation here. And we're looking at this phase, we're looking at these sort of golden brown features. These are all ditches. So what we've got is a sort of rectangular enclosure up here. This double line here, which could be either a trackway or a pathway, or perhaps a hedge bank. So you imagine a bank with a hedge on top and then a ditch either side. No way of telling really which one. And then a series of ditches running down here, defining narrow pens or enclosures. And then this one's going to be quite difficult to make out, but along that side there's a really long, narrow enclosure. And these are sort of fairly close to the Carrant Brook, so that's about 80 metres away. And the pottery from these deposits, so out of the fills of the ditches, dates to about the 12th to 14th century. So we're in the medieval period here very, very firmly. And we were able to correspond that with radiocarbon dates from some charred barley grains, so grains that have been harvested and then stored and then either parched prior to storage, so you try and dry them out to stop them germinating, and then during the parching process, a few of them have burnt, or they've burnt during cooking. And that enables us to get radiocarbon dates on them, and the dates spanned AD 31 to 1218, which sort of corresponds with the earlier sort of range of the pottery there. So putting those together, it sort of sounds like it's a sort of 12th century establishment. So perhaps, you know, if I'm going to take a leap of faith, something that may have been established after the Norman conquest, and perhaps by the earliest sort of foundations of the abbey, perhaps. There are always some perhapses in archaeology, and that's going to be one of them, but probably around the 12th century. So our enclosure at the end, up here, this rectangular enclosure, it's about 30 metres by 15 metres, so, you know, decent size, I don't know, something along, so it's broadly similar to the footprint of this church hall. And we think, although we didn't find any building foundations, that's probably the most likely location for a building, so a farm. We're interpreting this as a farmstead, and for this period you very rarely get any sort of building traces. They built either on sill beams, so we're thinking sort of timber framed structures on wooden sill beams, or cob built structures, so sort of clay walls, and that they just don't leave any archaeological trace. You need sort of either deep post holes, or you need big foundation trenches for them to actually survive in the ground, and that's absolutely typical for this region in this period. You can sort of suspect the presence of buildings by the shapes of rectangular enclosures like this, and also from the finds that are distributed around the enclosure ditches. People were sort of there's no rubbish, there's no municipal rubbish bin collection, so you're chucking your rubbish into the nearest available ditch, or you're keeping it in a midden to use as manure, and then some of it ends up in the ditch anyway, just by, you know, general erosion processes. So we're pretty sure that's where a farmhouse would have been. And then you've got these sort of these enclosure ditches here, which are probably agricultural. They could be horticultural plots, or small pens for livestock. The very long, narrow structure here, which is about 55 metres long and 5 metres wide, I'm pretty convinced that that's what we call a sheepcote, and I'll come on to that a bit later on. But a sheepcote's basically a medieval way of overwintering sheep. They would cram them in very tight, sort of 1 sheep per square yard, I think was the medieval recommendation. And it was, well, it was a way of keeping them warm over winter. The medieval idea was that you would keep your sheep indoors over winter rather than out on the fields. And that's absolutely typical for manorial sheepcotes. They tend to be very long, narrow structures like that. Peasant farmers also had them, but they were much smaller. They had smaller flocks of sheep. So something like that would be typical for a sheep flock of around 300 sheep, which is the ideal in medieval terms. That's what documents tend to refer to, 300 sheep. A peasant farmer, you know, if you're a reasonably well-off peasant farmer who is farming sheep, you might have, say, 60 sheep. So your sheepcote is a lot smaller. So we now come to our next stratigraphic phase, which is when the moat comes along. So it's the slightly more dramatic archaeology. Oh no, I've got to go back, sorry. Right, can I go back? No, yes, right. Right, well, imagine, if you will, that last slide. Well, there's the moat platform is basically overlying the southern half of that site. It was about sort of 8 metres to 15 metres wide and up to 3.5 metres deep. So it's a big ditch, very substantial. We actually took what we call geoarchaeological samples through the fills. So we excavate sections across the ditch so we can see them in profile, and we can see how the different fills have built up over time. Did I see a hand? No. And then we can take very detailed samples of those, which we can analyse in the lab, and that can tell us in great detail about the soil formation processes. So whether it's been material washed in by wind or rain, if it's been permanently waterlogged or seasonally waterlogged, and so on. unsurprisingly, the moat held water. Great. Sounds like a great revelation, but not every moat did hold water. Quite a few of them were dry, but in Tewkesbury, funnily enough, the moat was wet. Inside the moat, we had a building, which is this. So that survived at the northern end of the moat, right up against the moat edge. Very little of it survived. I mean, you can see you've just got a single course of stone foundations, and we're probably looking at a timber-framed structure which would have been built off these foundations here. They're reasonably well built. There's sort of there's one big quoin at the corner, and another one there has been robbed. So it's probably a building of some quality. And we also had a medieval bridge, which I'll come on to next, a nice wooden bridge. Elsewhere in the moat platform, we had a dew pond, so that's a big shallow pond typically associated with livestock, something that fills naturally with water. And the building from the earlier phase could well have still been standing at the time. So the original medieval farmhouse may well have been standing whilst they were building that. So you can imagine the tenant farmers here still living in that original farmhouse while this new one is being built. And then I would imagine that older farmhouse might have been repurposed. It could have been used for other members of the family, so elderly parents. So typically with a medieval peasant family, the elderly parents would then be sent off into what we would call a granny annex, but they would have been put into a different building, or it could have been repurposed as a barn or dairy or some sort of other agricultural building. We also found this. Now this is a slightly later. It's a late medieval building. I should have said about the dating here. It's very difficult to date moats. I'll come on to the dating in sort of more detail on the next slide, but it's very difficult to date moats for various reasons. So we know the original farmstead started around the 12th century, and it's probably still in a continuous occupation whilst this moat is being dug. We know the moat is in use sort of in the 15th century. I'll come on to that in a moment. But we don't really know when the moat originated. So there is a bit of a gap in our knowledge, but that's the nature of archaeology. It's all old stuff and it survives very partially. This is slightly later, but it's built when the moat is still there and this farmhouse is still occupied. It's what we call an aisled building. So you're looking along its length. There's one wall there, this sort of silvery grey stone line, another one there, and then you can probably just make out these sort of dots along the middle. Those are what we call post pads, so they're spreads of stone which would be the bases onto which you'd have wooden columns holding up the roof. So it's a large building with sort of stone side walls, probably timber above that level, and then a series of timbers along the middle, creating this aisled building. So I'm going to come on to the interpretation now. That's what we found, but what do we make of it? So our earliest documentary reference to the site dates to 1535, when it was a freehold estate known as Cowfield. There's a nice sort of clue in the name, Cowfield, there, belonging to Tewkesbury Abbey. So we know it definitely belonged to Tewkesbury Abbey at that point in 1535, and I would suspect it always had done. We can't really prove that it always belonged to the Abbey, but there are various strands of evidence that go and suggest that. It's typical that Abbeys would own estates like that. It's a source of income. So Abbeys are just the same as any other lord. They have estates, they have peasants of various levels on the estates, and they also have tenant farmers on their manorial farms, which I think this one is. So these are all sources of income for the Abbey. And their peasants would have paid in terms of cash and in kind, which is sort of supplying goods, produce from the farm, and in dues, which are their sort of labour dues. So you have to go and work on the main abbey farm for such and such a period, or you have to do other work for the abbey, every so often. And the farm would have. We're thinking it's a manorial farm for the abbey. You've got the monks there. This farm is a manorial farm. In other words, it's not an independently owned farm by peasant farmers. It's owned by the abbey, and it's farmed by tenants of the abbey. And it's quite a grand sort of arrangement. Physically, it's quite a grand, imposing building. And it's sat within a wider estate. So it's not just the farm that we've excavated, not just this moated site. This single estate would have encompassed quite a wide range of resources, including that mill that we saw on the earlier slide. And along with that, you'd have had meadows as well. And we're pretty sure it's primarily a vackery. So that's a specialist cow rearing site. Think American cowboys, that sort of thing. It's primarily a vackery, and the clue's in the name really. So vackeries, they are, as I say, they're specialist cattle ranches. They're not necessarily exclusively for cattle. Farmers then as now need to diversify in order to survive really, both in terms of cash and in terms of beating the climate and the various sort of diseases that can cause problems. So a vackery would be a huge uptake of land. You'd have had waterside meadows, so think back to the Carrant Brook, you've got ready access to those. Hay fields, so you need your hay for overwintering cattle, so you need specialist fields to grow that hay in. You'd have also had the home farm with the farmhouse and the cowshed, so I'm pretty sure the aisled building would have been a cowshed. And if you remember, it's located outside the moat, and that's absolutely typical for moated sites with cowsheds. The cowsheds are outside the moat. The moat is the sort of posh area by and large, and the outside is the ruder sort of agricultural landscape. And as well as that, you'd have had a lot of woodland as well interspersed amongst your landscape, probably wood pasture. So that top photograph gives you a sort of impression of what wood pasture is. It's grazing with woodlands sort of dotted around, sort of fairly familiar to anyone who's walked through the Cotswolds much. That's we've all seen things like that. It's quite a complex ecosystem in medieval economic terms, in that you can happily graze your cattle there, but if there are a lot of oak trees, the oaks will shed acorns, which if the cattle eat too many of them will cause problems. So then you can turn your pigs loose in there. They'll snuffle up the acorns. Pigs only really have one use, and that's for creating bacon. So you've got a nice ready source of meat, and you're protecting your cows. And you've also got plenty of wood, which everything you do that requires heating requires wood. Basketry, building works, they all require timber, but also fodder as well. So if they would have collected beech leaves in the height of the summer for storage as winter fodder. So that's not something we do now, but that was a standard medieval practice. So they're storing fodder in terms of beech leaves and in terms of hay as well. So in the medieval period, we're used to eating nice steaks or what have you, if you like that. But the cattle then were primarily dairy animals, as well as some kept for traction. So most of the cattle they're keeping are producing primarily cheese, because milk isn't going to keep all that long. That's their main produce on this farm. Bullocks and older cattle would have been driven on the hoof to Tewkesbury, which is barely any distance from this farmstead. So we should envision the landscape would have had a series of droveways where you could drive your cattle down. Occasionally we find these droveways on archaeological sites, fairly common aspects of the landscape, and quite a few of our modern footpaths are based on those. So they're taking bullocks and older cattle down to Tewkesbury, either to the abbey or to the town itself, and they would have been butchered by specialist butchers there. We don't know that from this site, but we know from other sites, such as work we've been doing in Bristol, that butchery was a very specialised thing. You have sort of very repetitive, consistent means of sort of reducing the carcass down and then processing it for food. And they would have used the meat typically in urban settings. You'd have had meat pies and broths and stews, that sort of thing. Again, we know that from evidence on other sites. We can take the pottery, and because it's fairly porous on the inside, it will soak up some of the lipids, the sort of fats and things from plants and animals and fish, and we can actually, I say we, very, very clever people, not me, can analyse this stuff and tell you the sorts of meat, so they can divide between, or they can sort of tell you whether it's sort of pork or cattle. They can tell you different types of plant, leafy greens. They can tell you fish and so on. So we can get quite a lot of information out of small bits of pottery on site. So we know from documentary evidence. So I'm going to put a bit of meat on the bones of the archaeology here, using wider documentary sources. Medieval documents are very clear that cattle rearing is it's differentiated by sex. So women tended to look after the cows, and men looked after the oxen, which are draft animals, and women tended to the cows and calves. The aisle building, as I said, probably a cow shed, and they're always located outside the moats. But we know from the certainly early on in the farm's history that they were also farming sheep. I mentioned a sheepcote. Here's a medieval illustration of one. It's shown as having sort of cutaway walls, but that might just be equivalent to what they've done on this house, so you can see the inside, but it would have had some sort of ventilation, presumably. But you can see how it's a long, narrow building. The sheep are all crammed in, which was considered to be a good thing. They like to be, they are herd animals, and they like to keep warm as well. And the loft there would have been a loft here in the rafters for the winter fodder as well. So they've probably got quite a mixed economy, specialising in cattle, but hedging their bets with some sheep, possibly some pigs, and maybe a bit of arable as well. The cattle would have been ideally suited for this sort of low-lying vale landscape. They like a lot of water. They have to drink a lot of water. They're big animals. Sheep don't like wet ground, so they must have been farming those higher up. So there must have been some slightly elevated ground within the estate. It may not have been directly attached to the land, so there may have been droveways leading through other estates to get to the higher ground. But interestingly, that implies some degree of transhumance of the population of the farm. So some of the people there are spending some of the year up on the sort of higher ground, perhaps upon the Cotswold uplands, with these flocks of sheep, and perhaps growing crops up there as well. You would typically turn your sheep loose onto the fields as a way of manuring the very thin Cotswold soils. So there's a nice, knowing that there are sheep there is a nice little glimpse into the lives of some of the people, in that they're not living all their time down on this farm. They're spending some time up on the uplands. So there's a notorious phrase in medieval history, nasty, brutal and short, to describe the lives of medieval people. Fortunately, we can sort of say no, that's at least some of the time that's complete rubbish. I mean, there were very dark days in parts of the medieval period, but for the most part, it's a much more nuanced history. And I've put this Bruegel picture at the bottom just to show some peasants having a jolly old time. There's a farm there. That's probably another sheepcote there. You can see them all being driven out of here, probably onto the onto their fields for grazing in the summer. So Chris Dyer, who's a very eminent archaeologist and historian, and he does a lot of work in this area. If you're interested in the subject of medieval peasants, I would absolutely point you to anything he's done. There are, he's written books, there are YouTube lectures, just look him up. He's absolutely fantastic. He would say that having based this on documents, he would say that a typical medieval farm would consist of the parents, 2 or 3 children, so they're not having massive families, and then any surviving grandparents, as I mentioned earlier, would be in a separate building. But that's not everyone living at the farm. You'd also have servants, so paid servants, but also young or slightly older children who are brought in as a form of poor relief. So sort of less wealthy peasants would allow their children to come to these somewhat richer peasant households to work on a bed and board basis. So it's a form of poor relief before poor relief actually existed, and obviously before the welfare state and so on. And then you've got labourers, so you would have farm labourers, some employed permanently, some employed on a sort of casual basis, as and when you've got the busier times in the farming year. And then you've got all sorts of other people, travelling tinkers and the like, doing repairs to your buildings and your tools and all the rest of it, and people being paid to clean out the moat. These aren't sort of downtrodden peasants. So whenever anyone sort of mentions medieval peasants, you get this sort of Monty Python-esque idea of people grovelling around in the mud. They're not like that at all. These are the middling rung of society. They're people we would, modern parlance, we would call them middle class. They're that's an anachronism for the period, but that's essentially what they are. They're the sort of people who organise village events. They're fundraising for the poor. They're paying for all the churches. All the churches we see around, they're called wall churches, but they're actually funded by medieval peasants. That's where the money comes from. They sit on juries, so that's quite a surprising aspect of medieval peasant life around the time this is going on. Somebody's desperate to come in and hear about medieval peasants, I think. They would sit on juries where they could actually take their lord to court and win. So the other people sitting on the juries are their neighbours. They're all peasants, and quite often they could defeat their lord in court. So they're increasingly powerful as the period goes on. And they live very sort of rich lives. They live on this farm, but they'll come into Tewkesbury as well. There'll be festivals going on in Tewkesbury. They'll be buying treats, pies. They'll be buying new clothes, etc., etc. They're not living sort of squalid lives at all. In terms of food, so they would eat a sort of standard peasant fare, which everybody's eating: vegetables, cereals, meat, stews, that sort of thing. But what we did find on our site were these clay dripping trays. So they're ceramic flat trays used for catching the dripping from roasted meat. They only have that one use. They're very well known to have that use. We've done this lipid analysis on them from other sites, including in Bristol. So we know absolutely that that's what they're being used for, and that's an elite dining practice. That roasted meat is expensive, and so these peasants are emulating their lords. It's throughout history, everybody's wanted to sort of emulate the people above them, and that's exactly what they're doing. And they're probably doing that in other respects as well. So they're eating the same food, they're probably following their same manners, trying to dress like them. There are various medieval law codes that try and restrict what peasants wear, because peasants are dressing too similarly to their lords, and then how can you possibly know who the peasant is? So you must not wear this, you must wear that. So they're aspirational. If they were around today, they'd be booking fancy holidays and parking a smart car on the drive. The buildings, I'm going to just really quickly look at the buildings because we can't say that much about them, very little survived, but they're probably akin to this one, which is a medieval building. If you ignore the chimney and the windows, just look at the sort of structure and the roof. This is a 14th century house in Oxfordshire, I think, yeah, Oxfordshire. It's probably very similar to what would have been there, although what we had at our site could have been even slightly grander. You know, it could have been a little bit more imposing, since it was built by the abbey, and they would probably build it to show off their wealth. Typically, it would be a single story, but you might have had mezzanine floors as well. And one side, the typical medieval ground plan would have had a sort of a cross passage, and one side you'd have your service room, so kitchen and so on, you know, and pantry and so on. And on the other side are the hall and the bedrooms, and the mum and dad sleep in the private bedroom. Everybody else sleeps in the hall. And as I mentioned earlier, the aisled building outside is probably a cowshed. So why build a moat? So there's a very furious debate in archaeology and history about moats and castles. You've got basically two opposing camps. You've got it's all about defence side, you know, which is the obvious interpretation. Then you've got it's all about symbolism side on the other, and they really do get some very heated academic debates. So I'm going to quickly run through the two sort of different strands of thought and then try and pull them together. They're both, there's truth in both of them. You know, it's you know, quite often the case, isn't it? But if we look at the sort of pragmatic values of moats first, they obviously do have some sort of defensive element. You're talking about an age with no police force and an age where there is brigandage, there are conflicts. I mean, you know, we're in Tewkesbury, Battle of Tewkesbury. This moat is around at the time of the Battle of Tewkesbury. So you know, it's a broad. This is somewhere else, but it's, you know, very similar. A ditch like that is going to at least deter casual brigandage or robbery. You would also, interestingly, although the moat platform is where you know, it's the sort of show-off area, the posh area of the farm, they would almost certainly have kept their bull there, so that's the most valuable animal they own. And we did find the dew pond that I mentioned. Around the edge of that, we took samples of the soil, and we found waterlogged remains of the sort of plants you get associated with grazing, so sort of nettles and things like that. Doesn't definitively prove, of course, that there was a bull there, but it's almost certainly what they would have done. And another pragmatic aspect of the moat is it would have provided fish. So we're living in a time when people are highly religious, and they like to be seen to be religious as well. So on fasting days, you wouldn't have eaten meat, but very conveniently, they classified fish and chicken as not meat. So fish readily available in these, and we did actually find fishing weights inside the moat. So, you know, that was very nice. All came together. And then you've got the other camp, so it's all about symbolism. It doesn't matter about defence. You know, if somebody wants to take a castle, they'll take a castle. I think Chateau Gaillard in France, it was an English castle, but in France. You know, it's supposed to be the most high-tech, best castle anyone had ever built, and it was taken when two Frenchmen climbed up the garde-robe, which is the toilet chute, and climbed in through a window, climbed inside, made a huge amount of noise, and the English thought, oh my gosh, we're, you know, surrounded by hundreds of Frenchmen, and they all surrendered. So you know, they're not immune to being attacked. So the symbolism crowd will say, actually, it's not really about defence. It's more about creating a narrative. So we're familiar with moats around castles. There's Bodiam, you know, probably certainly one of the nicest examples. And then you've got slightly further down the social hierarchy, the houses of the gentry. There's one with a moat around, and that trickled down through society until you got to the wealthier peasants. So any aspiring wealthy peasant would have put a moat around their farmstead. And there are literally thousands of moats across Britain. So, you know, they were doing this on a very grand scale. So it's a way of saying, you know, actually I'm one of the better sort. I've got a moat, you know. And it's a very obvious symbol in an age that's pre-literate. So really only the monks are people who can read. So these sort of visual symbols are doubly important back then. It's the way you convey messages. So along with the sort of the symbolism and the defence ideas, there are some other ideas around moats which aren't sort of quite so obvious to our modern minds. So they're a way of separating out the private area of the farmstead. So here's a little idealised medieval illustration of some people inside their house. As you can see, they're fairly well-off people, but you know this would have applied equally slightly further down the social scale. They're inside, and then that contrasts with the land outside the moat, which is this sort of ruder agricultural landscape, which is, you know, it's wild, it's other, it's fraught with danger and so on. And the moat provides a sort of conceptual barrier between the two. Water also has religious connotations. So include, you know, this is a Christian society, so it's, you know, it's a very readily understood to medieval minds symbol of purity, and it's also a symbolic barrier around the lady of the house. So we're talking an age where inheritance is patrilineal, so the lady of the house has to be seen to be chaste. You know, if you think of how many medieval wars started over questions of inheritance, then you know that shows you why that was important. I mean, we're talking ideals here. Medieval women didn't spend their entire lives sitting down doing needlepoint or reading books or whatever. You know, elite, wealthy sort of medieval women, they would have been out deer hunting, so they would have led very active lives, and women were absolutely involved in the farming tasks as well. So you know, these are just medieval ideals rather than the reality. So the documentary research shows that the farmstead survived the dissolution. So after the abbey had suffered in the dissolution, its lands were confiscated and they went into private ownership. We think that the farm probably lasted into the 1720s, 1770s, something like that. We don't get any finds after that date, so there's a definite stop. And then the brick farm, the one that burnt down in 2004, was built sometime later. We can't really put a date on that. Probably late 18th century, and that was ultimately occupied by a family until it burnt down in 2004. And that brought to an end around 900 years, which I reckoned was about 45 generations of farming on there. So you know, that's quite a big depth of history, I think. So that is everything I can tell you about Cowfield Farm. There was a slide which somehow I seem to have slipped past, which showed a few of the other finds from the site. And you can see them in our online article, but I'll quickly mention them. So the pottery I've mentioned. There were also things like there was a crotal bell. The crotal bells are basically the equivalent to a car horn. You'd put them on your carriage or your bullock cart just to warn that you're coming. And there was the book clasp, which I have to mention because Moncks. So it's clasped from a book. It's a sort of hinge. If you imagine a big leather volume, they've got sort of various reinforcements and hinges on them. This is a hinge. The only literate people are going to be monks, so it must have been a visitor from the abbey. And you know, with a bit of imagination, we can suggest it's somebody coming along to their tenant farmer and doing an annual stock take. And this clasp got lost, trodden into the mud. And when this poor monk returned, you can imagine him having to go up to the abbot or whoever his immediate superior was and saying, "Look, sorry, I've broken the book. And there you go. You can imagine it was a bit of penance to be done there. We also found a pilgrim badge. So this is very contemporary with Chaucer, you know, the Canterbury Tales. This pilgrim badge shows Michael slaying the dragon, and stylistically it's equivalent to ones from Mont Saint-Michel in France. So they're not, again, coming back to their sort of lifestyle, they're not these downtrodden peasants. These are well-travelled people. Some of them have gone as far afield as Mont Saint-Michel. In terms of dating the moat, I should have said that unfortunately for archaeologists, moats get cleaned out. So as they gradually fill up with these horrible sort of smelly silts and people throw rubbish in them, you then have to employ gangs of labourers to come along and scour them out. Well, that's great if you're living there, but it's rubbish, you know, centuries later for the poor archaeologist, because it means all the earliest finds have been taken away and dumped somewhere else as manure on fields, because, you know, these lovely silts and so on make great manure. So actually dating the early origins of the moat is really difficult. So that's why we can't tell quite how old it is. But the medieval bridge, which is a wooden structure, definitely existed in the 15th century, because we were able to do this dendrochronological analysis of the wood. So that's basically tree ring dating. We're all familiar with tree rings. If you get a sequence of tree rings overlapping from modern back in time, you can then take each season and each year and work out exactly when that sort of old tree was felled. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's basically the principle. You have to have the right species of tree. You can't do it with elm, for example, because modern elms in this country aren't really available. But oak, which is what most of the bridge was made out of, we could do it with, and we could see that it had been built in the 1550s and then rebuilt in the 1450s and 1470s. So during the time of the Wars of the Roses, to put it into some context. So I've whittled on for far too long. I'm very happy to take any questions anyone might have.